Hey everybody, I'm Jess Lupini, and this is The Words Don't Fit the Picture, the show where we untangle the strange and fascinating relationship between gender, voice, and identity. This episode is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Kathryn Campbell-Kibler, an associate professor of linguistics at Ohio State University. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I would suggest going back and doing that first, so that you're not jumping into this conversation halfway through. When we last left off, we were talking about what helps us perceive voices as being more masculine or more feminine, and how variable those differences are across cultures. Here's part 2 of our conversation. When I started initially looking into this topic, I was like, gosh, it seems like there's no research on these specific questions I'm trying to answer. And now here I am, however long into it, and I'm going, oh, it's because they're impossible to answer. It's because there's no possible way we can ever untangle this stuff.
It is. It's very, very complicated because humans are complicated, right? And the meanings that we want to make about our world are complicated. So yeah, there's no easy way to get through it, unfortunately. Or fortunately, complication is fun sometimes.
In general, though, it seems like there are some things that are more broader across more cultures, and those, I guess, the broadest ones tend to be the ones that are physical, like changes that tend to be very different depending on whether you went through puberty on estrogen or testosterone. And then as you get further and further away from that, from the things that are physical differences, it sounds like they're just more and more and more cultural. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think what happens is that people pick up on the meanings that are around them, and then they want to do stuff with them. And often what they want to do is exaggerate them. So there's something in sociolinguistics we talk about called fractal recursivity, where we take divisions between anything, but groups of people is a sort of a prominent one. And we kind of apply that division within the groups, right? So this is where you see stuff like, oh, well, if on average men are taller than women, then that must mean that if you're taller, then you're like being more of a man, because you're sort of taking this thing that kind of belongs to the group. And then if you have more of it, you're doing more of that thing. And if you have less of it, then you're doing less of that thing, right? So then that's where you get these kinds of cultural assumptions or norms that get put on people that, then taller men are treated as sort of being more successfully masculine in some way, right? So it's taking these differences and then applying them at different levels, right? And so that's where I think we get stuff like little kids differentiating their pitch, their fundamental frequency at a very young age, right? Because they're picking up on the culture around them that says it's not just that there's physical differences in people's larynxes, it's that these sounds mean something important, right? And so we're going to do something with them. Often that's exaggerating those differences, but not always. Sometimes you get these places, these cultures, these moments where people say, actually, we're going to try to squish these together. We're going to do less of that difference.
So I want to talk about exaggeration for a second, because you brought it up and it's making me think of a few things. Something that is often said about trans women that some people consider transphobic and other people consider a true observation is that a lot of trans women exhibit like a hyper femininity that some people can accuse them of seeming like it's mocking femininity or womanhood in some way. And I don't want to necessarily unpack everything that goes into that specific comment, because it's a complicated one. And I think a lot of the time it comes from a place of bad faith. But I do think there's a piece of it that I want to poke at, which is this idea of, I have certainly observed that it's true, and it's something I've experienced myself, that I often feel like I'm fighting against the current when it comes to being gendered correctly. And so when it comes to physical appearance or speech, there's an element of feeling like, okay, if I have the right combination of levers pulled and variables in a certain way, people are going to recognize me as a woman and not a man. But I don't know what those are. I don't exactly know where the threshold is where I cross over from most people around me in my culture are going to assume I'm a man to most people are going to assume I'm a woman. And so I think I have felt certainly the pull to be like, well, I'm going to pull every single lever and get myself so far over that line that I'm not going to have to deal with this thing that makes me uncomfortable, which is getting misgendered.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that at all, or that tendency, or like maybe the effectiveness of that strategy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think there's sort of two big answers. The sort of more general linguistic-y one is, yeah, redundancy is so common in language and in social signaling in general. Um, even for folks who aren't routinely getting misperceived, but in general, we just have this tendency to like pile on. If I want people to perceive me a particular way, I can't trust that they're just going to pick up one instance of my S fronting or whatever and be like, oh, I gotcha, like it's fine. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to like do all the S's, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, right? So there's a ton of that in language in general. It's not something that's unusual by any means. But then, yeah, I think in cases where people are being policed, and particularly where that policing is particularly harsh and judgmental, as it is for trans women, then I think it makes a ton of sense to have that reaction to say, I don't like this experience. I don't like it when people are responding to me that way. And like, how can I navigate my world in a way that minimizes that pushback, right? It makes me think of the whistling Vivaldi example that Claude Steele talked about years ago in his discussion of stereotype threat, right? Of using literally whistling Vivaldi as a way of diffusing people's reactions to him walking down the street as a Black man in the Stanford neighborhood, in the area in Palo Alto near Stanford, where he would whistle Vivaldi and sort of use that as a way for people to be like, oh, like he's not one of those, right? Like he's okay, right? He's say, I'm not in any danger, as a way of diffusing the danger against himself, right? So yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know whether it is true that trans women are sort of producing more femininity per minute than other women are, right? Like, nobody's done that study, and I don't think they should, frankly. But I mean, I think even if it were true, it would be a completely understandable reaction, right? And I think for individual people to
Mm-hmm.
make that choice, I think that's where, also personality comes into play, right? When you feel yourself being policed, some people in some situations with particular experiences are inclined to say, okay, I'm going to do everything I can to successfully be read in this way, right? And other people are going to be like, we're not supposed to swear. So I don't know how to end that sentence, but right. So other people get to potentially push back and say like, okay, well, maybe I don't want that. Right. And not to mention that there's just that factor of like, independent of the policing, who do you want to be? Right. For all of us, we're always figuring that out. What kind of person, what kind of woman, what kind of professor, what kind of whatever, do I want to be? What's my version of inhabiting this category? And that's, a lifelong question for all of us.
Talking about sort of being policed or feeling threatened in some way, um, would you be able to talk a little bit about code switching in the context of like linguistics?
Yeah. Yeah. So code switching, sort of broadly speaking, is the practice of using multiple varieties across different contexts. Um, so it's very commonly associated, or I think probably for a lot of folks, when they first hear the term code switching, they think about African Americans in particular. That I think that's where it gets used in sort of public spaces a lot. So referring to folks who have command over varieties that read as African American and maybe they experience as being particularly at home or a way of sounding or feeling authentically Black, and then other varieties that are sort of fine-tuned to pass muster or to be sort of perceived as non-threatening or appropriate or professional, or what all of these particular judgments might be, particularly in professional contexts, right? So at work, but any place where it's sort of a potentially like a white dominated situation. So more generally, code switching can apply to anybody who's has sort of enough linguistic difference that we might want to call them different varieties, although that's not a particularly technical distinction. But where people sort of perceive themselves or are perceived by others as having really distinct styles or distinct language varieties across different contexts.
So, I mean, I definitely notice myself um, taking on what I think of as like a more feminine sounding voice when I'm in situations with people who I don't necessarily know or who don't know me well. And I'm like looking to increase the chances that I'm going to get gendered correctly off the bat. Whereas when I'm with people who I'm comfortable with, my friends, my family, people who've known me for a long time, I tend to not feel any of that pressure. And I talk the way that I more or less have my entire life that I'm aware of.
Yeah. So this notion of sort of, I think one of the ingredients in code switching a lot that gets talked about and deserves to be talked about is sort of effort and intimacy and the relationship between those. Because you could imagine a world where everybody just said, "Oh, like strangers perceive me in a way that I want them to if I talk like this. So I will just always talk like that," and like problem solved, right? And I think there are in fact people that have adjusted their whole repertoire to be more formal or more feminine or more whatever in order to sort of grab at these meanings that matter to them. But a lot of people don't do that. And the sort of ingredient there, one of the ingredients there is a sense of your own identity and who you are, and a sense of comfort of sort of sounding like yourself to yourself, right? Sounding like you belong to your community if the language variety in question is about community, but even just sounding like ourselves. And part of that, I think, is what we're used to, and that it's effortful to change. But part of it is also the emotional connection of being able to feel like we're being our own authentic selves, right? And that then translates into being a way of offering intimacy to people, right? To say, if I know you well or I trust you, then one of the ways I can show that is by using the variety that I think of as my true self and not using the variety that I use to protect myself among strangers, right? So then you can get these kinds of layers of meanings of your own experience of your variety, but then also it becomes a way of interacting with people and sharing, right? By sort of allowing them that intimacy of something that you think of as a more protected version of yourself.
Can that process by which people categorize the gender of a person they're speaking with, can that change?
I think so. I don't know of any work on it. But sort of based on everything I know about language in general, we know that people change both how they use language and how they perceive language over the course of their lives. And we know that one of the big ways they do that is by being exposed to different people and different types of people, right? So some of the really classic examples are stuff like if you have never heard somebody speaking English with a Mandarin accent, then you have more trouble understanding the first time you do than if you've spent your whole life or even a few hours or a few weeks hearing somebody with that kind of accent. Once you get that experience under your belt, you're better at it, right? Because your linguistic brain is actually pretty good at saying like, "Oh, I'm a little lost, but hold on, I'll just twiddle some things and we'll get it used to this, right?" And then after a while, it's like, "Okay, I've got it. I've got a model for this kind of way of sounding. So the next time somebody comes at me that sounds like that, now I know what to do." Right. And so all of that would make me expect that you would see similar kinds of development in people's experiences in general. So if somebody spends a lot of time with people whose linguistic gendered presentation is different than they had heard before, they're going to update their models of what those categories sound like, or what people sound like, and they're going to shift both how they hear linguistically in the sense of how they actually process and understand the language, but also they'll shift their social perceptions.
So that's kind of tying into something I was thinking a bit about, like my own personal experience, which is when I was early in my transition, I found that some people in my life really struggled to consistently gender me with she, her. But then as time went by, for some people, that's just not a problem anymore. Whereas for others, it's still a very clear, conscious, deliberate process to get it right. And I can tell that their first instinct is still to go back to he, him. And I can almost see them overriding it. So, what do you think is going on there between the difference between those two groups?
That's really interesting. It's hard to tell because there's probably a lot of different things that might go on for different people. But I think one possibility, and again, I'm actually speaking a little bit less as a linguist and more just as a person who uses language on this one. I think one of the things that can happen is that for some folks, their pronoun use and sort of other linguistic markers may be really heavily tied to what we might want to call a perception of gender. But for other folks, it may be a habit or tied to directly to the person or their sort of representation of someone. So one thing that I would wonder about is sort of depth, like how much time that person has spent with you over both of your lifetimes, and sort of how much exposure they had or how much practice they had using the older forms. Um, because I suspect that there's a few different paths that somebody's brain might take there, where for some folks, it's coming from something that is about gendered perception, and for other folks it's coming from, but these are the words that I've always used for this person, um, and not necessarily running through what I might think of as like an intervening gendered perception. But again, that this is me speculating wildly. I don't think that we don't have good research on this. I think it's something that's likely to happen soon, right? So we're in a really exciting time in linguistics right now for this stuff, because there's sort of a younger generation of trans linguists that are just, there's so many of them coming up, and they're in the sort of, the early grad school or just finishing up their PhDs and getting out there into as professors. And like, I think there's just so much work on translinguistics that has been blossoming, but also I can kind of see looming as folks get graduated and get settled and really start being able to kind of do this work from a more secure place. So I think hopefully soon we'll know a lot more about some of these questions.
That's really exciting. It's cool to hear that. I mean, it lines up with what, like, I would just love to see some research into this, because I do notice so much that, like, queer people, trans, non-binary people especially, are so much better at switching how they gender people, whereas some cis people have no problem with it, but a lot of them do, like, even if they're really good at getting my pronouns right, having now known me out for a long time, they still completely flounder when it comes to another trans person. So like they've made the switch for one person, but they haven't redirected the bigger pathway in some way. And I'd love to see more work into why that is.
It is, yeah, it is very interesting. I have a lot of psycholinguistics questions about this stuff, because I had always heard, and I kind of expected, that sort of people would say like, oh, time and practice. Like if you don't get somebody's pronouns right, like keep practicing at it and over time you'll get better. And my experience has been that I shift, if somebody tells me that they have different pronouns than they had last time I saw them, that my experience is that I'm pretty good at shifting almost entirely, upon command. But that lingering, like, few percent and a little bit more inside my head that doesn't always make it out, as I'm like, no, right? That it doesn't necessarily trail off. It just kind of hovers.
Coming back to some of the linguistic variables that people can exhibit differently. You mentioned that those variables can be interpreted differently by different listeners depending on the context. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that study that you sent me a while ago, the perceived sexuality of men.
The same feature can really show up differently for different people, and sort of in different ways depending on what they're trying to do. So yeah, Lal Zimin has this really great study looking at a series of a set of transmasculine speakers, looking at them sort of over time. And one of the things that he examined or that he measured in their speech was how they ended up using S as over the course of the voice changes that they were experiencing on testosterone. And where I think a kind of simplistic set of assumptions might predict that you'd expect everybody to either keep their S the same or sort of make their S further back, right? Because we just said, well, front S means feminine and back S means masculine, right? So we could tell a story, or we could imagine someone trying to tell a story that says like, oh, well, here are these transmasculine folks. So, and they're on T, so their voices are changing to sort of be more masculine, and that's a choice they've made. They're being more masculine, so maybe like their S's should become more masculine, right? Like we could imagine a very simplistic story that would predict that. Lal is not a simplistic person, so he did not predict that, but he was just asking what was happening, right? And what he found was that different of the speakers, they did different things, right? And part of what that depended on was their relationship to the sort of notions or the categories of men or masculine, because different people have different relationships to them. And so one of the things that he found was that for a few of the speakers, they actually started fronting their S's. So doing the more feminine thing, right, in this simplistic view. And Zimon's interpretation of this, right, was that what was happening was that for some of them, they had pretty complex relationship with masculinity, that they identified with masculinity. And in some sense, sure, they were kind of moving towards that in some meaningful way. But they also didn't want to kind of fully or sort of unproblematically inhabit the category of man or the category of masculine and just have people be like, oh, look, there's that dude going by, right? They wanted some complexity there, or they wanted some distance from that. And so as the fundamental frequency and the formant changes that they experienced from the effect of the testosterone on their larynx, as that progressed, they were not strategically in the sense of consciously deciding necessarily, they may have been, but they didn't need to be conscious of it in order to do it. They were manipulating their use of S to kind of offset that effect, right? So that they weren't sounding kind of all the way masculine or as it more extremely masculine, right? So people can get very kind of strategic about putting these meanings together. We talked about redundancy a little bit ago, and so often people will be redundant with their meanings, but that redundancy in the system also means that we can use the multiple channels to get a little more complex and say, actually, I don't want every single one of the 20 different ways I can signal my gender. I don't want them saying the same thing. I want some of them saying something different, because that's actually what I'm trying to say, right? That we have that ability to kind of put these pieces together in complex ways.
So sort of being able to tell a more complicated story, like a more nuanced story about who you are as a person with a combination of those levers that isn't just like, full blast on everything.
Exactly.
It feels really obvious to me why trans people have an interest in changing their voices. And I think a lot of cis people also get it. Like when it comes to when trans people are saying, hey, I want to change how I sound, I think a lot of the time there's an understanding of like, yeah, I get it. Why you might want to sound more like the gender that you identify with. But it seems like you've given a few examples of how cis people also change their voices all the time. Is that something that's extremely common as well?
Yeah. I mean, people changing their voices either easily just because they're moving through the world and they find that particular versions of their self fit in particular contexts, or through a lot of effort, accent training and these kinds of things. It's really, really common for people to shift how they use language in order to do stuff in their social world. Actually, one really small but highly gendered version of this is I have a corpus of college students' speech. And some of that includes them performing versions of themselves where they try to sound as masculine as possible or as feminine as possible, whatever it means to them. And when you look at the pitch variation, the college women move in both directions. So they get higher when they're trying to sound as feminine as possible relative to their baseline, and they get lower when they're trying to sound masculine. And the men get higher when they try to sound feminine, but they don't get any lower when they're trying to sound masculine. And then if you look at the distribution of their baselines are skewed. The distribution of their pitch is skewed, which I think is because they're all inhabiting kind of the lowest range of their physically possible pitch all the time. Like these college men, you just say, hey, read this word list just in your normal voice, and they're like working down here all the time. Like they can't get any lower because they're already talking like this. And, I talked to somebody about this who had recordings from like 40-year-old men, and they're not doing it. Like it's really just these like 18 to 25-year-old men that are just living, like they're just using their sort of voice control to just kind of hang out as physically low in their fundamental frequency range as they can. And it's just a little thing, it always makes me feel so bad for them. Like, it just sounds like so much work, like there's just like putting this effort in all the time when they're talking, right? But that's a gendered performance, right? They're not only are they doing gender, like everybody is sort of always doing some kind of gender, but they're like doing gender in a particularly effortful way, right? Something that just kind of takes a little bit more work all the time than just regular talking. So yeah, it is absolutely not specific to trans people of like putting effort into your voice to make it sound the way you want, particularly in a gendered way.
I would like to ask you what area of research or like what studies would you like to see more of in this field?
That is a good question. I have a grant proposal that I'm not writing yet because I have a lot of research that's been done that hasn't been written up and published yet. So I'm not allowed to write a grant proposal until I've done that. But what I would like to see is, in terms of just what I'm interested in for myself, not like what the field needs, is I think looking at people's experiences over the course of working to change their voice, I think is a really neat opportunity to look at notions of effort and control. This is something that I'm interested in just in general in my work, is sort of what people are aware of, in different ways of being aware of their voices, and what they have control over, what they feel like they have control over. And so I think people that are going on kind of a bit of a journey of like, I need things from my voice. Like I have stronger thoughts and feelings than just the everyday, and I'm going to spend some time really thinking about my voice and focusing on it. I think that represents a really interesting moment, to ask questions about awareness and control. So that's a little, that's an interest that I have, and I've got a graduate student that is also interested in these questions. So my hope is that we'll be able to explore some of that. But I think in the broader sense, just of like where the field is going, um, I think I'm not as much. I'm more of a spectator, right? And in translinguistics, I'm watching some of these younger folks come up and do their thing, and I'm really excited about it. I'm not really in charge of what they're doing, but I think some of these psycholinguistics questions about how are we processing, new forms of language, these are also control questions, right? So the stuff like pronouns, what's going on with people when they don't get it right, or when they can't get it right over an extended period of time, like those are some interesting control questions. As well, there's a lot of stuff about, meaning making and perception, right? So a student of mine who's now an assistant professor at Penn State, they just finished their PhD this past summer, has been looking at, okay, well, what if you look at different listeners? So doing this kind of speaker evaluation work, but saying, okay, so if you've got Black non-binary speakers doing their own gender and doing their own thing, how do white cis listeners hear them? How do white trans listeners hear them? How do Black cis listeners hear them, and there weren't a lot of Black trans listeners in their study to study how they think, right? But there's like, what is the difference between listening within the community, perceiving within your own community versus perceiving outside the community? So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions about that. And as I think as more and more, especially as more non-binary linguists are asking questions about what does it mean to live outside the binary, there are a lot of really interesting questions about how those experiences sort of pile up and then shape our ability to perceive other people.
Yeah, I would love to see more research into how people think about non-binary voices too, because that's and categorize them in general. Like I find that so interesting that so often I will hear a voice that my brain doesn't even try to categorize, and it's like, oh, it's like that's such an androgynous or non-binary sounding voice to me, which I know it's still an assumption I'm making about that person's voice, but I'm aware that I have a bucket in my brain that I'm sorting some voices into, and I definitely know some people don't seem to have that bucket yet. They haven't developed a bucket where they even quickly or slowly sort people into a non-binary category before learning what they actually are. And I'm curious about that process and whether it can change or improve with time.
Yeah, exactly. I think that would be some really interesting research to look at sort of how our buckets change, because we know they must, because people learn and grow, right? But there's hasn't been any work on like, what does that look like, right? From not having, like, only having 2 buckets to having 3 or more buckets, like what step by step, what is that process like? We don't know anything about that.
Yeah, oh, I'd love to know more about that. I mean, I know something at some point in my life has changed how I hear and categorize voices, but I can't put my finger on what exactly it is. I just know that I don't associate voice with gender the way I know I did 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. So hopefully folks will be figuring out some of that stuff in the coming years.
Cool. Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you so much for talking with me about all of this stuff today. It's genuinely so interesting.
This was really fun. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Hopefully I'll get to talk to you soon, and we'll see some more of this research that we're both hoping is going to show up.
That sounds great.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kathryn.
All right, bye-bye.